Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Chuck Mason. Welcome, Chuck. And Chuck's going to talk to us today about cemetery and funeral home records. And that's something, I guess, one of the first things we're going to start looking at when we start doing genealogy.
It usually is, because that's the last records we're going to find of our ancestors.
And what kind of cemetery death records exist?
Well, it depends a lot on the cemetery and what kind of records they kept. It also sometimes depends on the state laws and what they were required, and then the diligence of the people in charge of keeping the records. So sometimes you have a great deal of records, and sometimes you find a mess of records.
I would imagine sometimes you find nothing in many abandoned cemeteries.
Well, that's a problem too, and fortunately, though, the Land Records Office in the county land records, county courthouse may have records.
Oh.
Also, a lot of old abandoned cemeteries, sometimes the local funeral director ends up with the records, and so that's a source. And of course, if it's a church-related cemetery, the church may have an archives of some sort that may have the records, even though the church is closed and the cemetery is no longer being used.
Historical societies?
And historical and genealogical societies, they have great collections. A lot of them are going out actively seeking records for their collection, which can really be a great help.
Yeah. I found that a couple of cemeteries we looked at had absolutely tremendous records.
Yes.
Everything's computerized now. We were just at one a couple of weeks ago, last month, and I couldn't find this one lot. I had all the numbers turned out. I had two numbers reversed on the certificate that I had, and they were able to look it up right away and give me the correct location.
Yes, a lot of cemeteries have great records and are really actively working on keeping them up and getting some of the old records taken care of and cleared up with problems.
I would imagine, though, that depends on whether they have the money or where that money is coming from to support.
Yes, it really, money plays into it a lot. Some organizations, cemeteries have formed organizations that will come in as volunteers and do some of the work. I've been reading about Hollywood Cemetery down in Richmond, and over the years they've had a lot of problems, particularly in the 19th century, and they had a ladies' association that came in and helped to raise funds and helped to do things to clean up the cemetery and make repairs of markers and the fences and roads and things through there.
Yeah, somehow we think that they're going to stay there forever, but you know, everything gets worn out, or tombstones start leaning or something as the ground gets soft or whatever.
Yes.
What about cemeteries that are no longer in existence?
Well, cemeteries that are no longer in existence, hopefully somebody has taken an interest in them. For example, here in Fairfax County, the Virginia Room out at the main Fairfax City Library, which the Virginia Room holds the genealogical collection, they have accumulated a great deal of information about the old cemeteries that are closed, no longer in existence, and Fairfax Genealogical Society started a project probably about 25 years ago where they went out and transcribed the markers, and that was the first place they started, was the Virginia Room and what records they had, and they worked from there to compile the books that they've published.
I know when my boys were young, they used to go to a cemetery once a year near us and clean it up. And it was a locked cemetery. It was right next to Springfield Mall. And I don't know where they got the key from, but somebody local must have had the key, but you couldn't get in unless you had a key.
Yes, and that's a fortunate thing, because unfortunately so many cemeteries are open, and that leaves them open to vandalism and all kinds of problems.
So what kind of records do the cemeteries keep? What would you find if you did go to the cemetery?
Well, again, it depends on the cemetery. Cemetery that I have a lot of family buried in. When I first got into genealogy, I went there and I wanted to know what kind of records they had, and they told me they had basically nothing but an index card that told them where the person was buried, when they were buried, and whether there was a marker or not. And just deep down inside, I knew they were lying to me. And as I progressed in my research, I happened to stumble across some microfilm in the local historical society's collection, and it was the records of this cemetery, and they were microfilmed in the mid-1980s, and this was the early 1990s that I was down there asking them about the records, and they kept 4 types of records. They kept one for the individual person's name, they kept one for the lot owner, they kept one for the lot itself, and then they kept one based on the date of interment, so it was a chronological record. And then I did find a miscellaneous book, which was kind of like a church register book, where they had information on it. And that happened to be for the time period that my grandparents buried a stillborn child in the cemetery. You know, other record cemeteries will have all kinds of records. They may have a copy of the death certificate, they may have a copy of the obituary, and just all kinds of things. I've found listings of pallbearers, I've found the deeds, I've found some cemeteries will actually fill out a genealogy of the person and keep records that way, and other cemeteries I've found where they will have a certain slip of paper that they ask certain questions, but every once in a while you find information that's not asked on there. For example, I had a great aunt who, on her record, it didn't ask for her date of birth, but it recorded her date of birth.
Oh,
so
okay.
I found that. So it's important to make sure that you go to the cemetery and see if they have records, and if they don't, or if they tell you they don't, another source is the Family History Library in Salt Lake, because the records I found for my family in the cemetery that they're buried in were microfilmed by Salt Lake, and they were there in the library there, but they also had them out in Salt Lake, so they've got a good collection of things.
Getting them from your local Family History Center church records is probably easier than going to the cemetery in most cases, unless it happens to be where you're living.
It is, but the one thing that you really want to do, because we also run into transcriptions of cemetery markers and things, and sometimes they will arrange them alphabetically. Well, that doesn't help you to know who all is buried in the family plot. So visiting the cemetery, if you really can, is important, because you can learn a great deal of information from looking at the plot. Who's buried around the family? Are they collateral relatives? And particularly if you've got a plot that's been enclosed with some kind of a fence or something, it can be important to make that visit.
Explain the difference between the burial place, the lot. You've used a couple of terms.
Well,
there.
it depends on...
Now, does a lot include several burials?
The cemetery, usually they will call it a section, which is a large area with lots of cemetery plots in it, and then they'll call it either a plot or a lot, depending on how they divide it up. And they may have a group of the lots together that they will sell to you. They may sell 2 at a time, or they may sell 6 at a time, or multiples like that. The odd one that I found is the cemetery in Philadelphia, where my great-grandparents and some great-aunts and uncles are buried. They bought 9 lots, and there are 3 in a row, 3 in a row, and 3 in a row. So it really depends on the cemetery and the terminology. Just like anything else around the country, different things are called different things.
Yeah, I also found the one Oak Ridge that we went to in Chicago, or at least the section that we were in, it had been a burial society that did it, and their families weren't together. I mean, it was unusual if a husband and wife were next to even a husband. Okay. Now, I found my aunt and her husband together, but like my great aunt was there, my grandmother was there. They're way different locations, and my great aunt's son was there, but again, they're way, they were there more or less in the sequence they died or something,
Yeah,
whatever the burial society happened to have an open area or
it
something.
may be, and that is sort of like with military cemeteries where you can't really go out and pick out where you're going to be buried. It's the next grave that they have available, and then whoever dies first, if a husband and wife are going to be buried there, whoever dies first is buried that way, and then they do bury the other person on top of them.
Oh, on top of them.
Yes.
Okay. Well, in Germany, we were one, and Sid was able to find the tombstone quite easily because he realized they were completely in sequential order. So all he had to do was look at the date. And many of them were in Hebrew that he couldn't read, but there were enough in regular letters, Latin letters, that he could, find the location pretty rapidly.
That might be a European custom.
That's
something that I don't know about, so I've learned something today.
Well, we found that in a couple of places that he was able to find them really quickly like that. When did funeral homes begin? I mean, that's another
Well,
thing
funeral homes really began, you had coffin makers who a lot of times were furniture makers, and they supplied the local people in the area with coffins. Usually they had to make them to order, and then as things progressed, if you remember the westerns like Bonanza and some of the others, there was the furniture dealer, and he usually had a room in the back, and so that kind of evolved from the furniture industry. And then with the Civil War and the embalming methods that began to evolve, the furniture dealers began to realize that, well, there's money in this, and so we can expand the business. So it really, in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century, the funeral home industry really expanded, and of course today it's billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah, well, they have pretty fancy coffins. In those days it was all wooden coffins, I would guess. And what kind of records did the funeral homes keep?
Well, the coffin makers used to basically keep some very basic records, but the Scott burial records that I found were interesting. This was Gloucester County, New Jersey, and it didn't include a whole lot of information, basically who he made the coffin for, and sometimes the dimensions, the cost. And if he buried the person, he usually included where he buried them. And this became very important, not to my family, but a project I was working on. We have a cemetery that goes back to Revolutionary War times, and unfortunately, with vandalism, there's only one standing marker and two partial markers left. And I found a 1954 or 56 transcription of the markers at that time, and I compared it with the coffin records, and I found people who were buried in that cemetery who weren't on that list. So either they didn't have markers or they didn't exist or survive. So that was very important. Then as time evolved, it depended on the business records that the owner actually wanted to keep and what kind of information. But then as the industry expanded, the government got involved and started to regulate it, and they started requiring things. So you can get the bare facts information of when somebody died and usually the cause of death and where they're buried, and all on up to today you can get all kinds of information, copies of the obituary, death certificate, and other records.
One of the things I found that's very important to remember when you're looking at funeral home records, remember the person who gave that information is bereaved and upset, and it don't depend 100% on it.
Right, exactly, and you have to do the same thing with the death certificate. You look at the informant, and two examples with my grandfather's, my mother's father, it has the wrong father for my grandfather, and my mother's brother gave the information, and why he had the wrong name I don't know, because my grandfather always told us he was named after his father. And my father's father my aunt's husband, who was a son-in-law, gave the information, and everything on there is correct, and I've been able to prove everything. So it really does.
I have the same kind of, Sid has the same kind of thing with his two grandmothers. One, everything is wrong. One, everything is right. Including the town they came from in Germany 50 years earlier than that. And but the one that was wrong was really funny because it was filled out by the doctor, and she hadn't even told the doctor the truth. He'd obviously asked her at some point, how long have you been here? And she answered how long she'd been in Chicago, which was like 20-some years less than she'd been in the country. So, and it says how long in the country. What he filled out was 29 years or something, and she'd been in there 49 years. And and her age was wrong because she even lied to the doctor how old she was. I mean, just everything was wrong. And the other one, as I said, and they were both in the city of Chicago, and they were both like within 5 years of each other, and it's exact same kind of form. So it really depends on the informant. And once I saw it was the doctor that filled it out, I realized, oh, she didn't even tell him anything.
Well, and you know, people, age was not as important to people. Really,
well, I think that women just wanted to be younger.
Well, that's true.
In particular.
That's true, but also until we had Social Security, it really didn't matter as much about
you wanted to be younger until you could get it.
And so we do run into those misinformation situations. So, but there are a number of things that the funeral homes will keep. One of the examples that I brought with me today is from my grandfather's sister, or grandfather and grandmother's daughter, rather, and it lists the payments when my grandparents actually made the payments. So I like to look at the records, and you can look at things, and from that I knew the family was poor, and this was during the Depression, and so the payments there that they made showed a struggle where other people would come in a few weeks after the funeral and pay the whole bill or the majority of the bill down, and then may come back a couple of weeks or months later and pay the whole thing off. So it does give you a variety of information on there that you can use.
Well, among Jews, there are burial societies, and these were started usually by people that came from a certain region, and there are all sorts of them, and I only have this vague idea that I can of what my parents did, and they belonged to a burial society in Chicago, and they paid some kind of a yearly fee. I have no idea what it was, and when they died, then that society took care of everything. You just told them the rabbi that you wanted to use, and then they took care of all of the other arrangements. So if somebody lived long, I guess they made more money on it. If they died right after joining, they would have lost some money. But my parents didn't die in Chicago, so they quit, you know, once they moved away from there. So I don't really know any of the details of it. But I know that there were many such societies in New York for various...
And it's sort of like our insurance policies that we have today, or even funeral homes today. You can prepay your arrangements, and then they invest the money, and it grows and hopefully covers all of the expenses.
In a way, it's a very good idea, because the family's so upset, especially if it's a sudden death, and you don't, you know, what am I going to do? What am I going to do?
Yes, that was the thing when my father got sick. He talked about going down and making the arrangements, and we did that. And it made the time when he actually did die so much easier. So, and one of the other records that I brought was actually one that I found. It's a slip of paper that one of the funeral homes filled out in the town that was next to where my grandparents lived. And I found this slip of paper in the Historical Society's collection, unrelated to my family. It had to do with businesses in that particular city. And then later they acquired the funeral home records. And so I was all excited that there was a lot of information on this. The only thing I really didn't know was the funeral home that they had used. I knew when he had died and where he was buried and all. And when they acquired the funeral home records, I was all excited because I thought, well, maybe there will be more information. in the actual funeral home records, there was only 2 lines.
Oh.
His name and when he died, and the cost of the casket and the cost of opening the grave. It didn't even give the cemetery. So
oh, you don't know where?
Well, I did know.
Oh,
I did know where he was buried, and the slip of paper they had filled out, and I don't know who actually got these slips of paper, whether it was the family or who, and so I have no idea how it got in these records that they had, but it had a great deal of information. The official records, they kept very little information.
Well, we ran into something about, maybe 20 years ago. We couldn't find my husband's grandmother, or great-grandmother, and he knew where she'd been buried. I mean, he knew for sure because she'd been buried in 56 or something like that. So, I mean, he was old enough to remember that.
Right.
And and then he was looking for somebody else that had died in 29, and his mother said, yes, she was buried there. And we went there, and we had a name that was slightly different. We had her formal name, which was Jenny Rachel, and she was buried under Ray, which was her nickname. Mm-hmm. The funeral home said, the cemetery says, no, we don't have anybody like that. And even though we gave the exact date, we went to the funeral home where we suspected that had buried it, and they had a whole bunch of information. They gave me a map. They showed me exactly where the burial was. Now, that funeral home, I guess, had several branches, and that particular branch closed. We went this time to a different branch when we were there because by now we want to take pictures of everything, in which we didn't do in those days. And they have only a little 3x5 card, so it didn't indicate where she was buried or anything. So what happened to the detailed information that they had before, I don't know.
Well,
could be in another location.
You might check another location. You might check and see if it got deposited with the Historical or Genealogical Society. Or another source is libraries like colleges and university libraries or state archives and libraries are collecting these as business records, and so they're in their manuscript collections, which...
Well, they seem to indicate they had destroyed some of the old records. So I don't know, it was just very vague. But fortunately, we knew where we were going, at least.
I had a friend who had an uncle who was buried in a cemetery in Philadelphia, and they went to the cemetery. They wanted to find the grave, and the cemetery was adamant that they did not have him. They did not sell single graves. And it wasn't until later she actually got the copy or the deed from somebody in the family, and she went back, and then they mysteriously found him could tell her where he was. But it was, in fact, a single grave the family had bought. He had never married, and the family had bought a single grave and buried him there. But the cemetery was going to deny he was there.
It somehow depends on the people that are working there and what mood they're in. And if they're not in the mood to help you, I'm sorry, we don't have any information. Until you say, well, this and this, and then they'll...
Yes, that's very, very true, and I tell students when I teach going to visit various repositories, usually the staff will go to lunch, or sometimes they will rotate shifts and all, and you go back a different day and look to see who's there. And a lot of times, particularly when people are on their lunch break, the person who's relieving them may not know quite what the rules are and may be willing to give you something they really shouldn't.
If they know where to find it.
If they know where to find it.
Now, you have one other note here. What are the black cards with black borders?
The black cards with the black borders are actually ones for my great-grandparents' family that came over from Scotland in the 1880s, and these were used in Europe and they were used here. The black border around them indicated to the mailman that this was an announcement of somebody's death and that they needed to deliver it as quickly as possible, because what happened a lot of times, we had newspapers that were only published once a week or maybe twice a week, and so if your family's like my family, I have lots of them that either died the afternoon of the newspaper being published in the morning or the next day, and they're buried by the following week. So this was the way that they notified people. And the one is a card, and of course these were sent to my great-grandparents.
Now, which one is up there now?
That's actually the letter. That's the one that it's a letter and it's folded up and was sealed and addressed on the back. And that is for a second great-grandfather, and actually somebody else filled in his wife's information, so I got a double record. And these were very interesting. I've seen a lot of them in collections, and one of the things that I've found is it can also help you to gauge a little bit of the family's wealth or lack of wealth, because if they are printed or engraved, then that usually indicates the family had some money. An awful lot of them were just like we have announcements and invitations today, where the basic information, the name and the place and the date are printed, and you fill in the information, stick it in the envelope and mail it off. But they were a great resource, because this notified people that someone had died. Otherwise you end up spending a lot of money with telegrams or trying to personally go and announce to people
that must be
died.
Something only from the United States, because I've never heard that before.
No, those were used in Europe. The two that I have are from Scotland.
Oh, really? Well, maybe up in England. I've never come across that before. Yeah. That was very. Is there any? We've just got a few more seconds left. Do you have anything that we haven't talked about that we should talk about?
I could always go on and on about death records, but you know, they're definitely a source you want to explore. You don't want to just look at the death certificate and the obituary and the death notice in the paper. Go out and look at the cemetery and contact the funeral home. See what they have.
Yeah, you know, the Jewish genealogy societies have started a project trying to find cemeteries and then index those, but that's a whole other story.
Yes.
But
yes.
Many historical societies are doing that
yes.
as well, so that's a good source. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate your coming today.